Good morning, everyone. Today is July 1st, 2021, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong Motan in the spring of 2020. There's no charge for these great webinars. We bring them to you in the hopes that you will contribute to a food bank to help fight food insecurity. And I'm delighted to say that we raised a huge amount of money just in the last week. And one of my favorite parts of the program every week is when we announce our running total. Jean Lawler, would you please do the honors?
Hi, yes, Jeff, thank you. The total so far, of which we know, because not every dollar is, of course, told back, people don't necessarily tell Natalie, but our total right now is $140,000. 495. So 140. We raised over $21,000 last week alone. So well done, everyone. That was fantastic.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. And thanks so much to our generous audiences in the alternative dispute resolution and litigation communities for being so generous to help fight food insecurity all over the world. We have a great program today on Bitcoin, blockchain, and mediation. We have a terrific speaker, Justin Wales. Justin has just moved his practice to K&L Gates. He splits his time between Los Angeles and Miami. He is the co-chair of the firm's blockchain and digital currency practice. Justin represents a wide range of blockchain, fintech, and financial services clients on fundraising and regulatory matters, including compliant token offerings. A recognized leader in the burgeoning cryptocurrency industry and early cryptocurrency adopter, Justin provides business and technical product counseling for his clients, as well as advice regarding domestic and international corporate formation options, intellectual property protection, and other general corporate matters. He speaks and writes often about the intersection between law and technology and authors the premier treatise published by Thomson Reuters on the application of state rules on blockchain and virtual currency businesses. I can tell you from personal experience working with Justin in mediation, he's an outstanding lawyer and here to educate us on a lot of cutting edge stuff. Justin, the floor is yours. Please tell us a bit about the food bank that's important to you, where we are encouraging people to contribute if they're in a financial position to do so. And then on with the show. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, and hello, everyone. The food bank that I chose is a kosher food bank in Surfside. I grew up in Miami. I still have a place in Miami, and I go back and forth pretty regularly. And you can't really meet anyone from the South Florida region who isn't either emotionally very impacted by the collapsed building from last week, or is 1 or 2 degrees of separation away. It's an incredibly religious area and a pretty predominantly Jewish area where this occurred. So the food bank that I chose is kosher because there are people who just need help and they have very specific dietary restrictions. So to the extent anyone can help, I think it's important for a lot of people who are suffering right now in that community.
Thank you. And we've posted the URL for the JCS Kosher Food Bank in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a very weird practice, and one that was not planned when I was exiting law school in 2012. I want to maybe talk a little bit about the practice, because I think that maybe gives a good understanding of the types of issues and how broad the Bitcoin, blockchain, virtual currency. We'll try to define some of these terms over the course of this presentation, but how broad the industry is and how its tentacles are sort of making their way into all different types of disputes that maybe would be surprising to some. So when I was in law school, all I wanted to do was be a constitutional lawyer. I wanted to work on First Amendment issues. It's like the dream of every law student, or at least a lot of them, I think. And I was lucky enough to find a job doing that. I was working with a guy out of South Florida named Richard Overman, who hired me basically right out of law school. He was the former general counsel of the Miami Herald, real titan in that very specific field, was partners with Dan Paul and the Paul and Thompson law firm, and worked a lot with like Floyd Abrams. So it was a real honor to be able to work with him. He actually passed away last year, so I'm sentimental about my time with him. But he was a great friend, a great mentor, became godfather to my son, and I would have been completely happy just doing First Amendment law, representing the media. I was really obsessed with it. But a funny thing happened is when I was in law school and I was obsessing about the First Amendment, I was really thinking about, speech and censorship. This is about 2010. The Obama administration had deemed WikiLeaks a terrorist organization and had put pressure on all these payment processors, Visa, PayPal, MasterCard, to not accept donations to WikiLeaks. So I was on Twitter in the law review office the day that changed my life, and Julian Assange posted a tweet and says, if you want to donate to us, you can't donate using PayPal or Visa anymore. Donate in Bitcoin. And I thought, well, what is Bitcoin? So I called a friend of mine who was technical, and I said, explain to me why this doesn't make sense. And he explained to me why it did. And I came into it from this censorship resistant payment processor point of view, rather than it's a market that's going to go up, and an investment product. At the time it was worth practically nothing. So I started getting really into Bitcoin and kind of making my way into the Bitcoin community. There were very few of us at the time, so we would just start talking. But to be to think you wanted to be a Bitcoin lawyer at the time was like saying you wanted to be a time travel lawyer. It was just not an option. So I took a career. I was doing First Amendment litigation. The firm I was at ended up merging into a larger firm called Carlton Fields, which was maybe a 400 or 500 lawyer firm at the time. And then in about late 2013, early 2014, some of my friends who were Bitcoin people started companies. And the types of issues that they were facing were, do I need a money transmission license? Is what I'm doing implicating securities or commodities regulations? How do I just get my head around the intellectual property or the corporate aspects to it? All things that were just at the time completely out of my wheelhouse. But I had a firm that had a corporate group and some securities lawyers and some payments lawyers. So I would basically quarterback their cases, interface with the clients, and kind of explain to the traditional lawyers, well, here's how this crypto issue, how Bitcoin, how the blockchain works, and how it might impact what your analysis is. And I found that my practice started becoming more and more geared toward the transactional and regulatory aspects of crypto, and less focused on litigation, just because it was pre-litigation. Like the entire industry was pre-litigation at the time. And in some ways it still kind of is, to be frank. There's a bit of litigation happening, but there's a tsunami coming with regard to really complicated issues, and we'll talk about those in a couple minutes. So cut to 2021, my practice is probably at this point 80-ish% transactional and regulatory. We represent exchanges, wallets, a lot of the infrastructure, larger infrastructure companies in the space on their corporate and regulatory work. We still do a lot of work in money transmission and the payment side of things. But what we're actually seeing is our clients who are at one point completely crypto native. These were blockchain companies in only dealing with Bitcoin and crypto users. Now they're more traditional companies are starting to become. So they're insurance companies that are having to deal with, is this type of asset covered under our policy? How do we think about assessing risks when you have really complicated issues regarding custody. How, you know, how do you custody? Who has custody over a completely digital asset? We're representing large brands who are now looking at, okay, we want to offer NFTs, but how do we, you know, get our heads around some of the IP issues, and how do we make sure that our contracts are forecasting what the eventual dispute will be? So this is all to say that the crypto and the Bitcoin and the blockchain is they're kind of making their way into lots of companies that weren't in this space, just because this is a digital asset in some ways characteristic somewhat like the internet, in that if you had gone to a lawyer in 1995, you would probably be able to find someone who had a website that said, I'm an internet lawyer. And that would be a niche, and they'd probably talk about new possibilities, you know, a conference about the internet and mediation. Some of you might have attended things like this. But now, you know, 30 years later, we are not talking about internet law, because internet law is just everything, right? So I think the same thing is going to happen with Bitcoin and blockchain, where Bitcoin, specifically Bitcoin's blockchain, will just eventually become the base layer of the internet as we know it. If you think about what the internet is, it continues to change. So the internet today is based on the same protocols, but it's an amalgamation of all of network developments, software developments, application developments that all come together, as well as cultural, you know, developments that all come together to give us the experience of the internet, right? The fact that we are able to have this call is not just because the internet developed, but it's because people at Zoom, you know, made this platform, because we as a community started to say, oh yeah, you know what, there is some value in being able to interact online and not everything has to be in person. It's all you know, an amalgamation. And that's sort of what you're seeing with blockchain as well, where you're able to actually create a base layer of the internet using blockchain, incentivize people all over the world using cryptocurrencies. This is the lowercase b Bitcoin as an example, to maintain basically a worldwide computer of networks, and then centralized and decentralized applications and platforms can be built on top of that, and it just becomes part of our everyday life. This is all a kind of by way of background, but there is some litigation that's happening, and there are, I think, some specific challenges that mediators, Jeff did a great job during our mediation, but I think it's fair to say that Jeff was not a subject matter expert in the, you know, field of decentralized finance, which we ended up having to mitigate some pretty interesting and sort of sci-fi issues in front of him. And this is really the challenge for you know, lawyers who are choosing mitigators, is that there's mediators. It's difficult to find someone who I think has the expertise. And really what I'm looking for when I'm looking for a mediator is not even someone who has an expertise on networks, or who, you know, understands what Bitcoin or blockchain is, because the stuff that I'm doing, I'm just assuming that no one understands, because it's just so far out there. No articles are being written about the things that I'm working on. It's really sci-fi. So what I'm looking for is a mediator who doesn't come into it with a preconceived notion of what this technology does, because for the most part, people don't really appreciate how advanced it's become, how used a lot of these protocols are, and the complete possibilities. So we've had situations where we've gone and you know, we've been in front of someone, and you know, they say, okay, well, yeah, this is all well and good, but it's all a scam, right? Or it's all a Ponzi scheme. And we're like, well, no, it's not a Ponzi scheme. It's a protocol. It's just a set of code that says if X happens, then Y happens, and you can input anything you want into that formula. And that's kind of like the basis of what decentralized finance is. So I think the most important thing that I can take away is, to the extent that you have a case that comes in front of you, is to have like a pretty open mind about what the technology does, and then to make an assessment about how these people have used this technology in a way that is either for good or for bad. There's a lot of scams, there's a lot of bad actors in the space, in the same way that there were a lot of scams and a lot of bad actors utilizing the internet and still utilizing the internet for bad. But the technology is neutral, right? It's just code. And people are really finding inventive ways of utilizing that code. So that's one. And from like a practitioner's perspective, that to me is the most important thing, is that I know that the first couple hours of, a mediation is, or, the first several pages of like our mediation statement, which was our case with Jeff, is just, here's an educational tool. Let me take you back. This is what the internet, how Bitcoin developed. Bitcoin created something called a blockchain. The blockchain has been used for many things and many different platforms. Some of those things is decentralized financial arrangements. Here's how decentralized financial arrangements are. Here's what our client does. Okay, now that we have an understanding, facts. And then usually once you get the definitions, and you can start to make analogies to things that maybe, the mediator or the judge is more familiar with. At that point, you find that a lot of the law applies in the same way, and that the crypto aspects are just window dressing. You kind of, use your instincts and sort of regular case law. So I'll pause there maybe for a moment, because I'm not sure what the level of sophistication in this room is, or if anyone has any dealt, but I'll just open up to questions before I maybe deal with specific types of issues that are important to understand, if anyone has any questions.
If there are questions, thank you, Justin. If there are questions, people can either post them in the chat for us to read,
Okay.
or if it's not that big a crowd, if people simply want to unmute themselves and ask the question, that's fine too.
Okay, fair enough. I'll continue.
Okay.
So, but if anyone does have any questions, so let me maybe speak a bit about the types of arrangements that you can, create using blockchains, and what the purpose of them really is. So everyone here has probably at least heard of Bitcoin at this point. Maybe you own some Bitcoin, probably through a place kind of like Coinbase. It's a company you pay for, you pay, they let you hold their Bitcoin on their books, and you're thinking of it as an investment product. As I said, Bitcoin is probably going to end up being like a predominant base layer of what we think about the internet in the future. And the reason why is because it allows, I see Brian. Once I finish, Brian, I'll answer your question. It allows a lot of folks to interact with each other directly without having to go through an intermediary. So I could send Jeff, if I want, $100 million directly to his Bitcoin wallet over the internet. I'm not going to, but over the internet, without having to go through a bank, without having to go through any sort of payment processor who will potentially censor it, who will potentially charge fees, who will potentially delay the transaction. I could also, interestingly enough, through the Bitcoin Lightning Network, send Jeff 1/140th of a penny's worth of Bitcoin, and I can do that every quarter of a second from here to eternity, and stream money to him in a way that is not otherwise possible currently on the internet. So that's like a pretty cool feature, but that's really just me transferring money back and forth, not the most interesting. I mean, there's interesting elements of it. You can maybe open up the different possibilities of communication, but it's not the most interesting thing. But through other blockchains like Ethereum, or using Bitcoin, something called a drive chain that's been proposed, I can also create these pretty interesting financial arrangements where I'm able to create a decentralized exchange where I can transfer to Jeff 1 Bitcoin for 10 Ether without having to go through an intermediary, effectively a broker dealer. You're seeing other types of assets and equities start to be transferred in that way. I can create automatic bearer instrument insurance products where the NFT, the token of the contract, is bearer. If I hold it and an event occurs, I will automatically get a payout. And these are sort of like structured like pari-mutuel contracts. So what I think the people in the space, the entrepreneurs in the space, are thinking is when there are issues or situations where you necessarily have a intermediary agency or an intermediary company dealing with the management of a contractual relationship. In most cases, especially if the asset or the obligation is being done on the internet and doesn't have to be enforced in the real world, you can completely get rid of the intermediary. In most cases, you can, in many cases, you can create insurance, financial arrangements, loans, all of this can be done from a technical perspective without having insurance companies or banks right in the middle, right? You just have these direct peer-to-peer relationships that are governed completely by the code. The code is law, is what is essentially said in these contexts. So when you have that, there's a question is, okay, something goes wrong with the code, right? The code may be audited, sometimes, maybe they're not audited correctly, but something goes wrong. Who's ultimately responsible? And this was somewhat of the case that we had mediated with Jeff. But this is a kind of an ongoing question of where does liability lie when someone, maybe it's one person or two people somewhere in the world, maybe they're known, maybe they're not known. They create this code, they're not trying to harm anyone, but there is an unforeseen exploit in the code. And that exploit causes people in the real world to be harmed, damage is done, money is lost. Okay, so who has ultimate liability, right? So the easy answer is say, oh, the people who created the code, they put it out there. But you're having these situations now where you have code that could be written in a very kind of open manner. It's just, we're putting this code out there. I think it'll be able to, be able to create a decentralized exchange with it. And now the community and a group of programmers all over the world are going to propose different amendments to the code. They're going to work on it collaboratively. It's now out there. A month later, it has $8 billion in assets under management effectively. And then there's an exploit. So does the person who originally thought of it and wrote the code and put it out there for the world to work on, are they liable? Or is at some point,
Justin, when you say
yeah.
when you say an exploit,
Mhm.
that's a new term for some people.
Sure.
What is an exploit?
It's just a part of the code that can be exploited by a bad actor in a way that was not intended by the writer, right? So a good example is in 2017, there was an incident called the DAO incident. DAOs are called decentralized autonomous organizations. And it's basically what we're talking here, which is it's not an organization like an entity or a company, but it's just a group of people who come together to create some sort of platform. And what's governing them is the code that is communally agreed upon. Yeah, DAO. It's communally agreed upon, but no one individual or entity takes ownership of the operations. It's just all protocol, right? If X happens, then Y happens. So what happened in 2016, 2017, it was on the Ethereum blockchain, is there was an exploit in a DAO that was basically a decentralized venture capital. So imagine instead of Jeff being the manager of a VC fund, and we all pay into the fund and he deploys our money, everyone in this Zoom room puts money into a smart contract, and then we all have basically tokens, governance tokens that say, we're going to vote on what projects get this money. But at any time, we're going to be able to take our money back, right? So it's basically acting as like almost like a hedge fund, right? But it's all decentralized. Well, what happened was when they were writing the code, and it lasted for several months before anyone realized this, there was a ability to exploit it where I would be able to actually take out my money before it registered in the master basically wallet. So what someone did was they started just taking back their money, but they did it many, many times. They were able to get refund on their money to the point where they were taking out a lot more money than they put in. And it caused, millions and millions and millions of dollars of damage. It caused the Ethereum blockchain to actually fork, meaning that the people who had like somewhat control, decentralization is not binary. You are not either decentralized or not. There are more decentralized products and less decentralized products. At the time, it was possible in the Ethereum blockchain to get a lot of the really big stakeholders and foundations to kind of pool their resources together to actually reverse some of these transactions. But that's the kind of example of an exploit. No one intended this exploit or put this in there in order to steal money, but it happens. So the question that I think we're dealing with as an industry right now is, at what point does a community project that goes out in the world, at what point does liability, if any point, start to dissipate from the original programmers, because it becomes taken over by the community? They really do not at some point have control over what ends up happening with the code. They don't have the ability to go and stop a transaction. So that's sort of one of the issues. I see there's a couple questions in the chat, so let me maybe read some of these. What concerns me is the lack of regulation. How is the cryptocurrency regulated? This is actually a really good question, and I think one of the misconceptions about crypto generally is that it's not regulated. It's very regulated, and it's also regulated differently depending on what we're talking about. So my day-to-day for years has been keeping track of the regulations at a state and federal level, and to a lesser degree, sort of international regulations. But take Bitcoin, for example. Bitcoin is regulated as a commodity. It's specifically not a security. The SEC has said it's not a security, and the reason why it's not a security is because it is quote unquote sufficiently decentralized, right? It can't be a security because there's no issuer, there's no company that is in the middle whose actions are the predominant reason why an investment would go up or down. Ethereum, which is less decentralized than Bitcoin, is also sufficiently decentralized and is not a security. That being said, Ripple, XRP, which you might have heard of, which is also a pretty big market cap cryptocurrency, primarily used for payment transfers. The SEC is suing them, saying that you are a security. And the lawsuit that's happening now in that case is Ripple saying, but you said Bitcoin's not a security and Ethereum's not a security. And we might not be as decentralized as Bitcoin, and we might not be as decentralized as Ethereum, but we're sufficiently decentralized. So the line of where a security, when something becomes a security or doesn't, is still somewhat gray. We apply the Howey test. There's been a couple, enforcement actions that have given us some guidelines, and the SEC has given us some guidelines. But that's for the security aspect of it. For derivatives products, swaps, this is for like Bitcoin. These are largely regulated as commodities, and it's fairly non-controversial. Where it gets a little interesting is every state has a different regime when it comes to how they regulate money. So states will have money transmission rules and license requirements. The state of New York passed basically an equivalent called a virtual currency license. We call it a BIT license to the Department of Financial Services. So every state has a different view on at what point, if any, Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies are money for, and whether they will be regulated under their state payments rules. Because there's 50 states, I encourage you guys to check out the treatise that's on Thompson Westlaw that I put together. You have some states treating Bitcoin as money and being very restrictive about how a company can come and build within their state or sell to their citizens, and some being very permissive. So here's a pretty good example. New York has a very restrictive virtual currency license. So they pretty much view every company that's dealing with virtual currencies in any way as regulated under the Department of Financial Service. You need to get a license. It takes, sometimes 18 months. It's a very long, arduous process. The state of Wyoming has really put a flag in the ground and said, we want to be the Delaware of crypto. They've passed a number of really permissive rules for companies that are operating in Wyoming, including exempting cryptocurrencies from their money transmission rules. They created a special deposit institute, which basically allows virtual currency companies to come in and create a state chartered bank in Wyoming, which gives them a lot of pretty permissive rules, and allows them, because it's a state chartered bank, it's effectively to operate in other states that recognize that bank without a money transmission license. The state of Texas has a wacky understanding where they say, well, the IRS doesn't view Bitcoin as money. It views Bitcoin as property. So therefore, we're not going to view Bitcoin as money. So if you transact with Bitcoin, or you have a Bitcoin business, you're not a money transmitter under Texas law. But if you're utilizing something called a stable coin, which is a virtual currency that is pegged one-to-one with a fiat currency like the dollar, right? At that point, well, that's money. So if you're using those types of coins, then you are a money transmitter. So there's a lot of regulation in the space. We're still trying to figure out exactly where some of the lines are. And a lot of, my job is talking to regulators, educating regulators, explaining to them not only what's happening in the space, but where things are going, and making sure that they understand, how to balance both protecting the public, which is obviously the most important thing, but also allowing people to innovate in a space that is, pretty innovative. Let me read the next question. And Brian, if you have a follow-up, please type in the chat. Wouldn't a mediator judge be better able to deal with the dispute if he has a good understanding of the blockchain technology? There's many who believe that cryptocurrency is widely used for terror financing. Have you faced such bias? Yeah, for sure. I've certainly faced that bias, but I think it's easy to overcome, because so much of the uncertainty and so much of the fear about terroristic financing, environmental issues, is really not, it's based in like a very narrow understanding of what the technology does, or it's based on sort of a 2014 set of circumstances that the industry has long passed. So one of the things about the use of cryptocurrency as for bad actors to do really terrible things, Bitcoin is incredibly traceable. So understanding that the blockchain is basically just a ledger where we all have everyone's records synonymously for every transaction that is made, it means that you can actually trace back the transaction I sent to Jeff. Well, Jeff will be able, or someone who is hired, the FBI, a private investigator, is able to look at the blockchain openly and see that, well, Jeff received funds from his wallet from another wallet that's my wallet. Maybe my wallet hit another wallet, which hit another wallet, which eventually hit Coinbase or one of these regulated entities. Almost any place that anyone in this chat room would be able to purchase Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies is going to AML KYC them. And that's because all of these money service businesses are registered either as money transmitters in the state, and they also are registered as money service businesses with FinCEN. So they have to do, terrorist screens. They have to do an AML KYC check. They all have to have compliance officers that are flagging suspicious transactions. You have to file currency transaction reports for transactions over a certain amount. So the on ramps and off ramps are like incredibly regulated, and you're pretty well tracked. That being said, there are certainly ways to obfuscate that. There are different coins that are specifically created as privacy coins. So if someone was going to want to do something really horrible, you would not use Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's pretty easily tracked. you would use something like Zcash or Monero, which allows you to really hide your identity and the transaction history in a more significant way. That being said, of course, a mediator or judge would be wonderful if they were familiar with blockchain, even if they just knew the definitional terms. But I've just found that not many people in the world are, let alone mediators or judges. But part of this exercise is to get everyone a little more familiar with blockchain and virtual currencies. And there's not a lot of lawyers in the space who I think are like really would consider themselves like industry lawyers. But for those of us who are, a lot of our time is just spent educating, having a conversation like this. There was a congressional hearing yesterday that some of my friends testified before about cryptocurrencies, and a lot of it is just educating. Let me read Ivan's question. I'm heavy in the space and has seen a lot of this in the past few months. Google even allowed an ad to run from a malware that masqueraded as OpenSea that stole wallet information. Yeah, well, and Google shouldn't have done that. They should have, probably better check their ads. What an NFT is a non-fungible token. And maybe this is important. I'm doing quite a bit of work there right now. And the idea is that what Bitcoin demonstrated and what the blockchain enables is for digital items to be scarce. And it's the first time in human history that we've been able to really solve this problem, what we used to call the double spend problem. And the reason we call it the double spend problem is it was, imagine in the Napster days with MP3s, right? Why was it so detrimental and damaging to the music industry? It's because if I make one copy of an MP3, I can make 1 million copies of it, and I can send it all over the world, and every copy is the exact same, right? You don't know which is the first copy, really. Well, it's the same problem you had with money, where if I had a digital dollar and I wanted to send it to one of you, you would never know if I didn't send that same dollar to someone else, right? And it becomes a problem. It's why you always needed something like PayPal, which is in the middle, or something like Visa, which says we're going to guarantee these transactions. What Satoshi, who created Bitcoin, figured out is there's a way to make digital items scarce. And the first best use case of that is money. But for quite a long time, we knew that there were other applications other than money that could use these types of digital scarcity tokens. We used to call them colored coins in Bitcoin. And then over the last couple of years, they become NFT. So the idea is basically you have a picture or video or some sort of digital item. We can actually tokenize that ownership, and you will be able to self-custody the ownership of the picture or digital asset, whatever it is, and either keep it for yourself or display it in like a public online wallet so other people can see your digital ownership, or you can trade it on the secondary market. So some of the big projects that have utilized this in the space is NBA Top Shots, which allows you to own moments from NBA games. There are digital art. You might have seen Christie's had a piece of art by an artist named Beeple, which was basically a digital file of 13 years worth of his digital art, and it sold for $69 million. So the natural question some of you might have is, well, it's just a digital picture. Why would anyone want to own that? Why would anyone think that's valuable? And there's several I think explanations for it. The first is that if you know anyone who really collects art, I know people who collect really, really high end art. And it's, these are the kinds of old Jewish guys with mustard on their shirt. They don't care what's on the wall. They like that they have an asset. They like the secondary market, right? And at some level, the art market is just a market. And the most important thing is ownership, right? So what you're really trading is ownership of these digital assets. That's sort of one perspective of it. The other is that there are things that you can do with a digital asset that you couldn't do with a regular asset. So for instance, if I'm a digital artist and I want to sell something to you, and I sell it to you for $100, you can then go sell it to $1,000, and I still only ever got $100. What you could do with NFTs is actually build in a automatic residual to the original artist. So artists really like this, because if I sell it to you for $100, I get $100. If you sell it for $1,000, maybe I get 10% and I get another $100. So it keeps the artist in the loop. That I think is overall pretty good. And the other thing you can do is, because the wallet is basically, someone's wallet will basically hold these NFTs in a custodial way, you can add other types of benefits. So for instance, what you're starting to see now is people selling NFTs of shoes, right? Let's put aside all of the interesting IP issues that come along with some of this technology. But if I have a digital pair of Nikes in my wallet, maybe my wallet is now going to be integrated into a metaverse or into a video game where I have an avatar. And now my avatar can actually wear the shoes that I own in real life, and the only way they can gain access to them is through my digital wallet, right? This is sort of where people are thinking. And I'm sure some of you are rolling your eyes and saying, well, who would ever want this? And my response is, how much time is your grandkid spending online? And it's going to be a lot, right? So the artifacts of the virtual world are, I think, to a generation that is even younger than I am, incredibly important to them. And we're just starting to see this grow with different types of platforms. As to cryptocurrency used for trust money, I don't view it as a bias. I view it as a reality. By way of example, the Arab bank cases. Yeah, Brian, there are certainly people using this technology for bad acts. The question, I think, becomes from one of a regulation is, what do you do to mitigate those uses, while also understanding that there are many uses outside of terrorist financing? We've pretty well regulated the on-ramps and off-ramps. We've also done things where, at least in the US, if you have an exchange, you're trying to deposit money in an exchange, what they'll do is they'll look to see whether the money that you're depositing has been what's called tumbled, meaning you're taking your money and tumbling it with all sorts of, and putting together with all sorts of other people's assets, so it doesn't look, so you can't figure out where the money comes from. Those types of transactions are completely barred from US regulated money transmission exchanges. The US is also just on basically blocked from most platforms that allow that type of activity. So I agree, these are things that we need to think about. The bigger question is, how do you balance that with the reality that virtual currencies are here to stay? What is the encryption key the feds used to get part of the ransom money back from Colonial Pipeline hackers? That surprised me based on the little I know about Bitcoin. This is a great example. So in the Colonial Pipeline attack, the hackers asked for a ransom to be paid in Bitcoin. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Bitcoin, and exactly, you know what, let me just actually grab this. It's in the other room. There's many ways of holding Bitcoin. You can hold it in complete self-custody on, it's effectively something that kind of looks like this. It's like looks like a USB. I could hold $1 billion onto this. I could hold $100 billion basically onto this. I could swallow it. No one would be able to get it, right? Or I can put it on Coinbase, or I can put it on an exchange, and I'm trusting someone else with the private keys. The feds didn't use an encryption key to get back someone's Bitcoin that they were holding in self-custody. What these hackers did was they kind of moved the money around to hide to make it look like they were hiding where it came from, and then they put it effectively on a self-custodial wallet, but where the keys were held on a public cloud server. So what the feds did was they just subpoenaed the cloud server, got the keys, and were able to recover. This is like a Bitcoin 101 mistake from the hackers, because they could have actually hid their keys much better, but very good for the FBI. It also shows though that there are companies that you can hire, like Elliptic is one of them, Chain Analysis is another, that are incredibly sophisticated and work with the Department of Justice. They work with state agencies and the FBI to help them view where different transactions are being made and how they're being set up. One of the things that you're actually seeing in kind of like the first wave of litigation in the space were actually like divorce and bankruptcy cases where someone knew that the other side had Bitcoin. I think one of the first cases I read was a wife knew her husband had Bitcoin, and he said, "Oh yeah, I do have Bitcoin. Here's my wallet. I have 2 Bitcoin, whatever it is. Here's 1 Bitcoin." And then she hired one of these companies, and it turns out he had made a transfer of like several $1 million of Bitcoin and just didn't tell her how much he had. So that's actually was like the first use of these types of companies. But now they all have contracts with the FBI and the Department of Justice. It's traceable to a wallet, but nothing after that. You can only really hold Bitcoin in a wallet, right? And wallet is just a term that we use because we're comfortable with that, but it's really private keys, right? So I can have the private keys to, a wallet is maybe the best way of describing it, but it's not like a physical wallet or anything like that. It's just an account that anyone can view, and the private keys allow me to take custody or control over that account. So you can trace Bitcoin. There's no way to not trace it. You can, unless you're like destroying the Bitcoin, or it's called burning the Bitcoin. It's just never used again. But as long as it's going from one wallet to another wallet to another wallet, you always know, where that wallet is. And what we're able to do from like the defense industry is we can actually track whether any coins are moving from a particular wallet or have ever touched a particular wallet that might be on like a terrorist watch list. OFAC actually like puts several wallets on a list that says if coins ever touch these, because these are known terroristic wallets, you can't accept them for your money service business. So we can trace them pretty well. The trick is, how do you identify a wallet with an individual? And that's where there's a bit of art. It sounds like blockchains essentially hold a permanent record of a virtual currency transaction, like a bank ledger. With so many transactions, how can you trace a transaction if there were an exploitation? How long would it take? A lot of these are set up automatically, so we pretty much know immediately where the ultimate beneficial wallet is, unless someone's doing something really kind of out there using ring signatures or tumblers, and we have to actually apply some computer analytics to it. That may take a little while, but you can come up with these answers of where the money is and what particular wallet of money is held in pretty quickly. Again, the problem and the trick is subpoenaing places like Coinbase or custodial wallets and trying to figure out the identity of individuals. As a mediator, would it look more like a facilitative mediation or evaluative mediation? I'm thinking that I need to have a good understanding of the process. Jeff, define mediation lingo for me, please.
I would say that in an evaluative mediation, the mediator participates more actively in the discussion of the merits of the case and is more forthcoming with opinions as to the strengths and weaknesses of people's claims and defenses.
I think it depends. I mean, look, it depends on the underlying case, I think, right? I think if you're dealing with an issue that is really one of first impression, I have an issue that I'm dealing with right now, which is basically, is there essentially representative standing to sue on behalf of a decentralized autonomous organization, right? This is something that there's no law review article on it. There's like a tweet thread that like a couple like lawyers who I knew like opined about this at some point. There's no case law that's really analogous. At that point, you're having a discussion, right? about whether this is something that could even go through. And there's, I think, some real art. It would be a really interesting challenge for how a mediator handled that. At the same time, if I may, at the same time, there are issues that we understand where the law is pretty clearly, right? Whether something is or is not a security in most instances, whether a husband fraudulently transferred Bitcoin is pretty, the law is clear. There's window dressing on this as being blockchain or cryptocurrency, but the law is fairly clear. Here's a good example of from a case that I worked on. A loss occurs on January 1st, and Bitcoin is worth $60,000, right? Making up dates and numbers. And then by the time we're in front of the mediator, Bitcoin is worth $30,000. The client lost 100 Bitcoin. How do you value that, right? Well, a couple of years ago, the answer was, the plaintiffs would say you value it in, at the time when you lost it. The defendants would say, no, you value it, just based on the Bitcoin. Well, that would require one sort of set of, mediation tactics. But now we pretty much know that the way you value it is as basically an intangible asset valued at the time of the loss, right? There's case law that is developed that, like, you can maybe challenge their assumptions, but that holding has been applied enough places that, okay, that's probably a pretty good way. So you can maybe push that if you're having a real debate over, how do we even think about valuing this type of thing? A part of it also, I think, what you'll probably find eventually is in the same way that in some technical industries, you have people who, oh, this is the mediator you go to if you have an energy dispute, right? Because you just don't want to spend so much time dealing with these types of issues, and they're generally up to, caught up with how the law has developed. I'm sure that, like, there will be instances where that sort of expertise will be necessary. And at that point, I'll ask Jeff, Jeff, how do I become a mediator? It seems like a really great job. And I'll ask him for some advice. Is a self-custody device like a thumb drive? So you can custody Bitcoin in so many ways. There are thumb drives like this. There are wallets where I have like several wallets on my phone that are my son, that are self-custodied. You can have what's called a paper wallet where all I'm writing down are 24 words that make up my encrypted private key, and I can remember those 24 words. So let's say I'm a refugee and I want to bring my money from one place to another. What do? I remember those 24 words. My family was all killed in the Holocaust, right? They left Poland. The ones that were lucky enough to survive came back after the war, and they found other people living in their house, and they lost everything. What would have happened if every day they just remembered as part of their evening prayers 24 words, right? Well, at the end, you still have something. And that's really like the global promise of what Bitcoin and this technology does. It allows you to actually own something. It actually allows you to actually hold something with you. And it's, from a kind of an upper middle class legal profession in the US perspective, well, this all seems sort of fanciful. But if you're in El Salvador, if you're in countries that don't have, a trustworthy federal financial policy, that have a history of regime change that causes people to lose everything. I think I'm kind of impacted by this also, just living in Miami for so long and hearing the stories of like the Cuban community. The ability to actually custody someone's own value and send that and take that with them, and it's powerful, especially to those who are just unbanked or underbanked. Well, those were the only questions, and I think we have only about 5 minutes left. If anyone has anything else, please let me know. My email address is justin.wales@klgates.com. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Or if you want like a list of resources, I have a Bitcoin 101 email that I end up sending out a couple times a day, which is basically here are like the 3 YouTube videos that'll give you a pretty good overview. here are like 4 books if you wanted to take the next step. Here's like several other resources if you find that your interests are going in different directions. But that might be helpful for this.
Justin, this was fantastic. Thank you. Let me just ask, in summing up, are there any other points you wanted to address that perhaps we skipped over in the give and take of conversation, or any predictions for the future you'd like to make?
I won't make any predictions, but I will say this. There's one other aspect of it that's actually pretty funky and might be interesting. And Jeff knows this firsthand. Usually what happens when you end a mediation, you come to a settlement, everyone's very happy, is they say, okay, you will wire X to my bank on this date. But in these cases, because the entire point is to create these automatic peer-to-peer relationships, what we actually had in the case that I did with Jeff was, we will stream cryptocurrency to your wallet automatically for the next 4 years, pro rata every second. And what we're going to do is we're going to create the code. You're going to audit the code. And once you approve the code, it's just going to automatically set. So there's nothing that I can do if you misaudit the code. There's nothing that I can do if you provide the wrong address. If you do that, then the money is just going to go away and you'll never be able to get it. So this was actually a challenge that we had with the case that I did with Jeff, which is, how do we document that? How do we make sure that the lawyer on the other side, gets his client's address correctly? How do we, up the cryptocurrency at the beginning of the settlement such that it's going to continuously stream the settlement payment to the other side? That was like sort of a fun issue in that case, and one that they don't teach you about that in any sort of program. You just have to kind of figure it out and say, this seems like the best course.
And just in a sense, it is an old wine in new bottles question, because if in a settlement someone says, you will wire money to my bank account at XYZ Bank and my bank account number is 12345, if the person providing that information gets it wrong, well, that's their own darn fault too, isn't it?
Yeah, but the difference is that if you wire it, at some point you're going to be able to fix it usually, right? There's a method for getting the money back. In this case, there's just no method at all. On top of that, it also, I think, changes in some ways, how the plaintiffs are thinking about how they're going to receive things back. So you could also have situations where you set up where the plaintiff's lawyer's fees are paid streaming, where instead of getting, take an example, 1/100th of a penny every second, the plaintiff's wallet is getting 2/3 of that every second, and the counsel's lawyer is getting 1/3 of that. So you can set up these things in a pretty interesting way that just have to be thought about when you have them in front of you.
It all has to be thought about. Justin, thank you so much. I know I believe I speak for mediators everywhere, and certainly for us baby boomer mediators everywhere, by saying this is really mind-expanding stuff. And I hope everybody finds it as much fun to learn these new things as I do. This was just a tremendous presentation. Thank you so much. If people are in a position to do so, please consider contributing to the JCS Kosher Food Bank to help the victims of the collapse in Florida, people in that area of Florida. It's jcsfl.org/programs/kosher-food-bank/. Justin, this was just tremendous. Thank you so much. Jean, Natalie, any final comments?
Say thank you. This is fascinating. Fascinating. Thank you so much, Justin.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Natalie?
Thank you, Justin. I know that this is a really complicated topic, and you made it very approachable, very consumer friendly. Thank you. I appreciate that.
And with that, my friends, we are complete.
Yeah, thanks.